In 1054 AD, two words changed Christianity forever: mutual excommunication. Rome and Constantinople, two powers of faith, faced each other not for the gospel, but for power. On one side, Pope Leo IX. On the other, Patriarch Michael Cerularius. Two altars, two empires, one God divided. Behind the prayers, there was gold. Behind the faith, politics. What seemed like doctrine was, in truth, rivalry. The Great Schism of the East was not just a spiritual rupture, it was a collapse of power, influence, and wealth. What really separated the Church? Faith or the throne? Before 1054, Christianity seemed indivisible. 5 great centers formed the heart of the faith: Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each held a piece of the apostolic heritage, a reflection of the early Church. For centuries, these patriarchates coexisted in relative harmony, until power began to speak louder than communion. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Rome rose as the spiritual voice of Western Christianity. The Pope had become more than a religious leader. He was a sovereign among kings, a mediator between heaven and the crown. Meanwhile, Constantinople flourished as the center of Eastern Christianity, the seat of the Byzantine Empire, where faith and state were interwoven into one. There, the patriarch shared the stage with the emperor, the cross and the throne side by side. The economy of faith grew. Lands, donations, tributes, and estates turned the Church into a financial powerhouse. Ecclesiastical wealth expanded quietly, yet steadily. The gold on the altars served not only liturgy, it funded wars, sustained palaces, and bought silence. Simony, the selling of church offices, emerged as a shadow in the heart of the Church, revealing a system where spiritual and political power dangerously merged. Amid this scene, 3 names stood out: Leo IX, the reforming pope, defender of absolute papal authority and Rome's supremacy over all Christendom; Michael Cerularius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, guardian of Eastern traditions and symbol of resistance against Western domination; and Constantine IX, the Byzantine emperor, striving to balance faith and politics, unaware that his neutrality only fueled the fire burning on both sides. Rome claimed to act in the name of Peter, Constantinople in the name of tradition. Both professed to fight for Christ, yet between the lines of their letters and decrees, another name was whispered: power. The altar began to turn into a throne, and the throne into currency. It all began with small cracks, subtle, almost imperceptible ones, differences in language, customs, and liturgy that, over the centuries, turned into towering walls. In the West, Rome spoke Latin. In the East, Constantinople prayed in Greek. The faith was the same, but the words no longer understood each other. This Western Christianity was shaped under the weight of papal authority. Eastern Christianity was built upon the consensus of the councils. The Roman Catholic Church saw in Peter the foundation of universal leadership. The Orthodox Church saw in Christ the only head of the Church. This theological tension, seemingly abstract, concealed a far more earthly struggle. Who held the power to decide the course of faith? At the center of the conflict stood the filioque, the phrase added to the creed by the West, declaring that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. For Rome, it was a legitimate affirmation. For Constantinople, a violation. The East saw in this unilateral addition not merely a doctrinal error, but an act of political arrogance, a symbol of how the West altered the faith without consultation, imposing its theology as law. Liturgical differences widened the abyss. Leavened bread versus unleavened bread, clerical celibacy in the West versus married priests in the East, the sign of the cross made left to right or right to left. Small gestures became banners of identity, each side claiming to be the true guardian of the early church. But behind these doctrinal disputes lay something deeper. The church controlled vast lands, collected tributes, and accumulated gold. Religious power sustained political power, and vice versa. Rome sought to consolidate its authority over all Christendom, including the East. The centralization of faith also meant control over wealth and imperial decisions. Constantinople resisted. There, the Patriarch did not bow to the Pope. The Byzantine throne did not submit to Rome. Faith is not currency, and the Patriarch is no vassal. That was the East's silent response. But as time passed, silence turned to tension, and tension into confrontation. At the dawn of the 11th century, tension between Rome and Constantinople reached a boiling point. For centuries, the two halves of Christendom had coexisted with cultural and doctrinal differences, but now something new was emerging, a struggle for command over the Christian world. Rome, under Pope Leo IX, was at the height of a centralizing policy. The pontiff, inspired by the Cluniac reforms in France, believed the church must be purified from corruption, and that the Pope was the sole legitimate mediator between God and mankind. But this spiritual reform came with administrative ambition, to bring all of Christendom under Roman rule. This idea, papal supremacy, was not only theological, but also a strategy of political and economic power. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire, ruled by Constantine IX Monomachos, faced both internal and external pressures. The empire was losing territory to Turkish invaders, its finances were in decline, and its once unquestioned imperial prestige was crumbling. For Patriarch Michael Cerularius, the Orthodox Church was the last pillar of Byzantine identity, and submitting to Rome meant surrendering its spiritual and cultural autonomy forever. Yet the tensions went beyond dogmas and hierarchies. Rome viewed the Eastern practice of married clergy and the use of leavened bread in communion with suspicion, calling it unfit to represent Christ's incorrupt body. In response, Constantinople denounced the use of unleavened bread by Westerners as a Judaizing practice. These accusations, which might seem mere liturgical disagreements, actually hid a struggle for legitimacy. Who preserved the true apostolic heritage? But the conflict reached far beyond theology. The Patriarchate of Constantinople had begun seizing properties that once belonged to Latin monks. At the same time, Venetian merchants, allies of Rome, were gaining privileges in Byzantine territory, enriching themselves at the expense of the local economy. Faith and gold became political weapons. While the Pope defended the purity of the Church, he also defended the revenues flowing from these possessions. In 1053, Leo IX sent letters to the East demanding obedience, invoking the authority received from Peter. In one of them, the Pope accused the Easterners of heresy, claiming that whoever rejected Rome rejected Christ. Cerularius replied first with silence, then with defiance. He ordered all Latin churches in Constantinople closed and the Pope's name removed from the liturgies. This act was not merely symbolic, it was political, economic, and spiritual. Constantinople had declared independence. Rome's response was swift. In 1054, the Pope sent a diplomatic mission composed of Humbert of Silva Candida, Frederick of Lorraine, the future Pope Stephen IX, and Peter of Amalfi. Officially, they came to negotiate reconciliation. In reality, they came to impose submission. Humbert was learned, fluent in Greek, and well-versed in the writings of the Church Fathers, but he was also obstinate and uncompromising. Upon arriving in Constantinople, he treated the Patriarch with coldness and arrogance. Instead of dialogue, he presented decrees. He met with Emperor Constantine IX, a political and hesitant man trying to keep the peace, and tried to persuade him to force the Patriarch's submission. Cerularius refused. He declared that the Pope was not the head of the universal church, but merely first among equals. In the corridors of the imperial palace, the atmosphere was tense. Byzantine bishops accused the Latin clergy of simony. The Roman envoys denounced what they called Greek superstitions. Theology was merely the varnish of a battle that was already about power, a struggle between Constantinople's ancient prestige and Rome's unstoppable rise. By July 1054, the deadlock had become unbearable. Talks ceased. Doors closed. The air in Constantinople smelled of rupture. Rome and the East were about to do the unthinkable: divide the body of the church in two. The heat of the Byzantine summer hung over Constantinople. The streets buzzed with murmurs and tension. Inside the monumental Hagia Sophia, the symbol of Byzantine glory and Eastern faith, the air was heavy, not with incense, but with hostility. On the morning of July 16, 1054, 3 Western figures crossed the atrium of the basilica. At their head was Humbert of Silva Candida, the cardinal Rome had sent to restore order. At his side walked Frederick of Lorraine and Peter of Amalfi, carrying documents sealed with the papal insignia. It was no courtesy visit, it was an ultimatum. Patriarch Michael Cerularius had refused to meet Humbert again. He considered him arrogant, a politician disguised as a theologian. Emperor Constantine IX, pressured by both sides, had pleaded for calm, but his authority was no longer enough to bridge the widening abyss. Humbert entered the church during the liturgy, walked slowly toward the golden altar, and without a word, placed upon it a bull of excommunication. The document declared Michael Cerularius and all who followed him separated from the communion of Peter. In other words, outside the church and outside salvation. Spiritually, it was ecclesiastical death. Politically, it was a calculated strike. The bull not only accused the patriarch of heresy, it listed offenses that mixed faith with politics. Humbert condemned the East for rejecting the filioque, for using leavened bread, for allowing priests to marry, and even for refusing Latin baptism. But between the lines was another kind of accusation: rebellion against Rome. It was the same tone once used by emperors, now echoed by the Pope. The scene shocked those present. Greek monks rushed to the altar to remove the document, but Humbert was already leaving the sanctuary, without looking back. As he passed through the bronze gates, he murmured, "The truth has been proclaimed." But to the Byzantines, it was sacrilege. 3 days later, Cerularius retaliated. He convened a synod, read the bull before dozens of bishops, and responded with a reciprocal excommunication. He declared that the Pope and his envoys were possessed by pride and corruption, and that Rome had strayed from the true faith. It was the mutual excommunication, the point of no return. Few remember that Emperor Constantine IX tried to undo the act. He sent messengers to Rome seeking reconciliation. But Pope Leo IX had died weeks earlier, a detail that rendered the excommunication legally invalid, since the papal mission no longer had authority. Even so, the gesture remained. It was no longer a matter of law. It was a matter of pride. In the years that followed, Byzantine chroniclers described the event as a theatrical tragedy. Some suggest the emperor regretted allowing the scene to unfold, realizing too late that what had been laid upon the altar was not merely a bull, it was the end of Christian unity. The schism did not come with shouts, but with silence. No army crossed borders, no sword was raised. But spiritually, it was an earthquake. In a single act, the church split into 2 worlds: the West, which became the Roman Catholic Apostolic Church, and the East, which solidified as the Orthodox Church. The wounds opened that morning in Hagia Sophia, never fully healed. The echoes of that gesture would become the backdrop for centuries of crusades, intrigues, and scandals. And ironically, it all began with 3 men, a parchment, and an altar. When the dust of the scandal settled, what remained were two churches, not merely divided, but mirrored, each claiming to be the true heir of apostolic faith. On one side, Western Christianity, centered in Rome under the Pope, who now emerged not only as a spiritual leader, but as an absolute religious monarch. On the other, Eastern Christianity, led by the Patriarch of Constantinople, grounded in conciliar tradition and in its close alliance with the Byzantine Empire. Rome organized itself into a vertical and centralized structure, with the Pope above all, cardinals and bishops beneath, and a theology increasingly legalistic and rational. In the East, the Orthodox Church maintained a collegial model, where patriarchs gathered as equals, reflecting the ancient synodality of the early Church. While the West became institution, the East remained communion. But the differences were not only in governance, they were in the very vision of the Church's role. In the West, the idea grew that the Church should dominate politics, guide kings, define laws, and crown emperors. In the East, the Church saw itself as inseparable from the state, a spiritual arm of the empire. But without the desire to rule it, this difference in mentality would shape the destiny of both civilizations for centuries. With the schism, Rome began to amass not only authority, but also wealth. The gold of the faithful and the lands donated to the Church multiplied. Latin monasteries became centers of economic power, and each parish a collection point. The tithe, the sacred tax, became mandatory, turning the Catholic Church into the largest landowner in the West. Constantinople, on the other hand, maintained a more contemplative faith, but lost political strength and international influence. The Byzantine Empire began to fragment internally. The eastern provinces suffered under Turkish pressure, and the Patriarchate, though respected, no longer had Rome's missionary reach. The East had become the guardian of tradition, at the cost of isolation. In Rome, the Pope consolidated unprecedented power. In the following century, the papacy would crown kings, excommunicate monarchs, and launch crusades. The spiritual throne had become a political one. The same man who spoke in the name of Christ now decided over borders, crowns, and armies. But the price of that rise would be high. With the increase of wealth came institutional corruption. Simony, which had already plagued the Church before the schism, became common practice. Bishops bought offices, monks sold fake relics, and indulgences began to be traded like divine contracts. What had begun as a struggle for purity of faith resulted in a system where spiritual power funded political power, and vice versa. As Rome grew stronger, Constantinople watched with suspicion. The rupture of 1054 had broken not only the communion between churches, but also the lines of trust between empires. Byzantine diplomats could no longer rely on Roman support, and Latin pilgrims began to look upon the East with contempt. This invisible rift would open the way, a century later, for one of the most shameful episodes in Christian history, the Crusades. But before the swords clashed, the chasm between faith and power had already been drawn. The West had become pragmatic and political, the East spiritual and defensive. Both, however, bore the same original sin: religious pride, the conviction that God was on only one side. The year 1054 was not merely the mark of a spiritual rupture. It was the birth of a new kind of empire, the empire of the altar, where faith became an instrument of governance, and gold its official language. After the mutual excommunication, Rome never looked back. Freed from Eastern restraints, the papacy began to build its own structure of power. The Western Catholic Church became a sovereign political entity, a force capable of rivaling any European kingdom. And unlike the empires that ruled by the sword, Rome would rule by the conscience. The Pope, now unquestioned, assumed a role no emperor had ever dared to claim: that of arbiter of kings. Under Leo IX and his successors, the chair of Peter turned into a global throne. The papal bull replaced the army, the anathema, the sword. A single decree could shake borders, depose monarchs, or justify wars. Centuries later, historian Joseph Guise would call this period the invention of moral government. Yet the papacy had become something far more complex, a state without defined borders, subjects in every Christian nation. To sustain this new order, an economic pillar was needed, and it emerged quickly. Pious donations, tithes, and land ownership. The church became owner of farms, mines, vineyards, and castles. By the 12th century, nearly one-third of all fertile land in Western Europe was under ecclesiastical control. Monasteries became centers of agricultural and commercial production, and, discreetly, God's banks. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire watched with growing unease. The Eastern Patriarchate still held spiritual influence, but it could no longer compete with Rome's economic might. Gold flowed westward, and the trade routes, once balanced, now tilted toward Venice and Genoa, allies of the papacy. Western faith began to fund armies, build cathedrals, and purchase loyalty. The East, on the other hand, sank into austerity and introspection. But the most silent and most dangerous aspect of this new era was the institutionalization of corruption. Simony, the ancient practice of buying religious offices, became endemic. Documents preserved in the Curia's archives record discreet agreements between bishops and papal legates, with payments made in gold bars, silver, or land titles. It was not uncommon for an abbot aspiring to become a bishop to send to the Vatican a devotional donation accompanied by a letter full of theological praise. In practice, it was a sanctified bribe. The very logic of spiritual power was being transformed. The forgiveness of sins, once dependent on confession and repentance, began to be translated into coins. The concept of indulgence was born modestly, as a form of substitute penance, but it quickly became a fundraising mechanism. Sins began to have prices, listed according to gravity. Murder, adultery, blasphemy, each had its cost. It was the exchange rate of the soul. Few mention that the first accounting records of this system came from the abbeys of Cluny and Tours, where monks meticulously logged donations and penances with fiscal precision. These books, written in commercial Latin, reveal how deeply the Church had embraced the logic of a mercantile empire. The altar had become a marketplace, the cross a seal of contract. As Rome accumulated power and wealth, the East sank into crisis. The Byzantine Empire faced Turkish pressure, internal conflict, and economic collapse. The Patriarch of Constantinople still excommunicated heretics and convened synods, but his voice no longer echoed beyond the golden walls of Hagia Sophia. The Christian East was shrinking, both geographically and spiritually. Rome, meanwhile, expanded in every direction. Faith had become a justification for politics, and politics the means to expand faith. The papacy financed alliances, manipulated royal marriages, and interfered in the succession of thrones. In 1077, when Emperor Henry IV knelt barefoot in the snow at Canossa, begging forgiveness from Pope Gregory VII, the world understood. The Pope was no longer merely the successor of Peter. He was the Lord of Christendom. But, as with every rise, cracks lay beneath the marble. The luxury of cardinals contrasted with the misery of peasants. Fake relics circulated through religious fairs like stocks of faith. Skulls of saints, fragments of the true cross, and pieces of Christ's tunic were sold for absurd sums. The sacred had become a product of the market. Constantinople, watching all this, saw the schism not merely as a theological error, but as the moral decay of the West. To the Byzantines, Rome had turned faith into enterprise, and the Pope into a spiritual emperor. Yet this criticism did not prevent the East from falling into its own isolation. The weakened Byzantine Empire began to depend on the very powers it despised, the Catholic merchants of Venice and Genoa, and it was this perverse, ironic economic bond that, a century later, would open the gates to the most shameful episode in Christian history, the sack of Constantinople in 1240. Thus, the Schism of 1054 was not merely a division between churches, it was the spark that transformed Christianity into a global structure of power. The altar replaced the throne, gold replaced grace, and the name of God became a seal of contract, a guarantee of credit, and an authorization for war. The empire of the altar had been born, and from it, no monarchy nor crusade would escape. For nearly 2 centuries after the schism, Rome and Constantinople lived in an ambiguous relationship, a mixture of rivalry, diplomacy, and feigned courtesy. There were attempts at reconciliation, but also silent conspiracies. Both sides knew they needed each other, the East in military and economic decline, the West seeking spiritual legitimacy and new trade routes. Yet every attempt to unite faith and politics inevitably ended in betrayal. Shortly after the schism, patriarchs and popes exchanged letters. There were gestures of goodwill, but always accompanied by demands. Rome demanded submission. Constantinople demanded equality, and neither church was willing to yield. The first major official effort at reconciliation took place at the Council of Lyon in 1274. The Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, under pressure from all sides, sought Western support against the advancing Turks. He knew that without military aid from the Catholic powers, France, Venice, and the Holy Roman Empire, Byzantium was doomed. So Michael sent emissaries to Rome and made the impossible promise to recognize the Pope as head of the Universal Church. The news shocked Constantinople. For the Orthodox clergy and people, it was seen as spiritual surrender. When the delegation returned with the signed union documents, crowds filled the streets, accusing the emperor of betraying the faith of the apostles. Public liturgies were suspended. The emperor's name was removed from prayers. Monks and patriarchs fled to monasteries and deserts, denouncing the agreement as the heresy of submission. The union existed only on paper. Michael VIII died, excommunicated by the East and discredited by the West. Rome, meanwhile, never sent the promised aid. The military support never came. The union had served only as a diplomatic instrument, a spiritual currency traded for political influence. But the failure of Lyon was only the prelude. Half a century earlier, the wound had been opened, in far bloodier fashion. The Fourth Crusade, called by Pope Innocent III, had been announced as an expedition to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. Yet behind the scenes, financial and political interests moved in the shadows. Venice, the leading naval power of the age, financed the expedition, offering ships in exchange for payments the Crusaders could never afford. Indebted to the Serene Republic, the Crusaders accepted a deal. Attack the Christian city of Zara, Venice's commercial rival. The Pope condemned the act, but conveniently did not cancel the crusade. Venetian gold spoke louder than theology. When the Byzantine prince Alexios IV Angelos promised to reward the Crusaders if they helped him reclaim the throne of Constantinople, the march changed direction. The crusade that was meant to free Jerusalem now set its course for the capital of Eastern Christendom. In April 1204, the unthinkable happened. Christian armies besieged a Christian city. For 3 days, Constantinople was plundered, churches desecrated, sacred icons destroyed, relics stolen and sold in the West. Chroniclers describe drunken soldiers desecrating the altar of Hagia Sophia, turning the sanctuary into a stable and a throne of mockery. The gold from the icons was melted down to fund new campaigns, and the patriarchal throne was given to a Latin bishop. It was the lowest point in Christian history. Brothers in faith, united in the name of Christ, destroying the most sacred city of the East in the name of profit and politics. Few mention that Pope Innocent III, upon hearing the news, was enraged. Yet instead of excommunicating the Crusaders, he accepted the outcome. The official justification was that the city had returned to obedience to Rome. In practice, the Vatican had just sanctioned the greatest ecclesiastical plunder of the Middle Ages. For nearly 6 decades, Constantinople remained under Latin rule. The Byzantine emperors fled to Nicaea, trying to rebuild what was left of the empire. When they finally recaptured the capital in 1261, they found it devastated. Libraries burned, monasteries looted, churches turned into warehouses. The city never regained its former splendor. The dream of reconciliation between East and West ended there, not with councils, but with swords and coins. The Pope had achieved by force what he could not by faith, and the Byzantine Patriarchate, betrayed and humiliated, withdrew into permanent isolation. From then on, each side saw itself as the true guardian of the faith, and the other as a corrupted shadow. Official history calls it the Fourth Crusade, but in truth, it was the first Christian war among Christians, the apex of the marriage between religion and power, and the most painful proof that when gold enters the altar, the gospel walks out the door. More than 9 centuries have passed since Rome and Constantinople excommunicated each other. But the wound opened in 1054 still beats, not only in the divisions between churches, but in the structures of power that were born from it. The Great Schism of the East was not merely a historical event. It was the blueprint for a system that continues to operate silently in the modern world. The separation between faith and power, which should have been the schism's lesson, never truly happened. Both East and West still carry the inheritance of the spiritual empire. The Pope remains a global political authority, received by heads of state and consulted by economic blocs. The Eastern patriarchs still govern with influence over regimes and local governments. The theocracy born in the 11th century has merely changed its form, but never disappeared. In Rome, the Vatican preserves the same principle that emerged after the schism, that of independent spiritual sovereignty. It is the only state in the world whose political power explicitly derives from faith. The corridors of the Apostolic Palace still operate as a system of government, complete with ministers, diplomats, and its own bank. The Institute for the Works of Religion, better known as the Vatican Bank, manages billions of euros, much of it from donations and investments that, ironically, echo the same logic as medieval indulgences. Few know that this bank, founded in 1942, has been involved in a series of financial scandals, from money laundering to the illicit financing of political regimes. The parallels with the medieval ecclesiastical economy are unsettling. The gold of the temples has been replaced by digital numbers, but the mechanism is the same: spiritual power sustaining and justifying economic power. In the East, the echo of the schism takes another form. The Orthodox churches, fragmented by political borders, reproduce the ancient struggle between throne and altar. In Russia, for example, the Patriarchate of Moscow has become a pillar of the state. Patriarch Kirill I, head of the Russian Orthodox Church, is today one of the most influential figures in the Kremlin. His rhetoric about the sacred mission of Christian Russia serves as an ideological tool, the same fusion of faith and power that once defined the Byzantine Empire. The difference is that now, instead of incense, there are microphones. Instead of bulls, political decrees. The pattern repeats itself. Modern Christianity has inherited from the schism not only theological division, but the logic of spiritual domination. And every time faith draws too close to power, the echo of 1054 returns. There is also a more subtle dimension, the financial one. Today, the great religious denominations, both Catholic and Orthodox, manage budgets comparable to those of small nations. The Catholic Church possesses assets worth hundreds of billions, spread across real estate, art, universities, and banks. The Eastern Orthodox world, though less centralized, maintains its own network of religious corporations and foundations, especially in Greece, Serbia, and Russia. The gold of faith never vanished, it merely changed appearance. And what is most disturbing is that the distance between altar and politics seems ever smaller. Bishops, cardinals, and patriarchs attend global economic forums, comment on geopolitics, and influence elections. The language has changed, but the principle remains the same. Spiritual authority converted into political capital. Even within the evangelical and Protestant world, born centuries after the Reformation as a reaction to papal corruption, the pattern repeats. Televangelists, megachurches, and charismatic leaders have accumulated fortunes and power under the same medieval slogan. God prospers those who serve him. But what began as faith has become industry. And what was meant to free souls now sells blessings. What we see is the globalization of the schism, the fragmentation of faith into autonomous powers, each claiming the truth while exploiting the sacred as an asset. From Rome to Moscow, from Constantinople to Brasilia, institutional Christianity repeats the mistakes of 1054, replacing communion with power and humility with influence. Christian theology teaches that a house divided cannot stand, but history shows that a divided house can indeed prosper if it learns to profit from its own division. The schism of the East did not only divide the church, it taught the world how to exploit the sacred as a system of power. Today, 1,000 years later, the garments are different, the coins are digital, and the bulls are official statements. But the structure remains the same, and the throne still speaks in the name of God. In the end, the question that hangs over this entire story is not who was right, but who remained faithful. Rome triumphed in gold, Constantinople triumphed in tradition, but Christ triumphed in silence. Far from palaces, far from crowns, far from councils. If today power, gold, and influence still dwell upon the altar, did the schism ever truly end? Reflect, comment, share.